Hey there, growth seekers. Welcome back to another inspiring episode of the Growing Forward podcast, where we talk all about personal growth, fulfillment, and unlocking your true potential. I'm your host, Jonathan.
And I'm Janelle. We're so excited to have you with us today. This podcast is all about helping you take those small but meaningful steps toward becoming the best version of yourself.
If this episode resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube.
Okay, Jonathan, let's kick things off.
All right, so have you ever heard that saying, that humans are like political animals?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And it's always kind of makes me think, like, are we actually, hardwired for connection? Is that just something that's part of who we are? So today we're going to be doing a deep dive into that very question.
I like it.
The importance of community. And we've got 3 sources that we're going to be looking at to help us kind of break this down.
Okay.
We've got an academic article. We've got a leadership-focused interview, and then a community development website.
Yeah, pretty eclectic mix.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting, and maybe we can start here, is in the Psychology Today article that we're looking at, brings up this fascinating point, that loneliness actually has a greater impact on mental well-being than objective social isolation. But then on the flip side, it says that social isolation, so like literally being alone, like that objective isolation, has a larger impact on physical health. So it's almost like they're saying that like feeling lonely is a different beast than just like being alone.
Yeah.
Which I think we've all probably felt that, right? Like I know I've been in a crowded room and felt completely lonely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a really common experience.
Totally. And so the article actually goes on to kind of break down these 2 sides of connectedness, this objective and subjective. And so, it's not just about how many people are in your life, but also how connected you feel to them.
It's about the quality of the connection, not just the quantity.
Yeah. So can you maybe break that down for me a little bit more? Like, what exactly does that mean? What are like some examples of objective versus subjective connectedness?
Sure. Yeah. So objective connection is like the measurable stuff. It's like, do you live with other people? How often do you see friends and family? Are you part of any groups or clubs? That kind of thing.
This is like the head count.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the structure of your social network. And then subjective connection is more about the quality of those relationships. Like, do you feel loved and supported in those relationships? Do you feel like you really belong? Do you feel seen and heard? And so you could have, a really big social network, but still feel lonely if those connections are very deep or meaningful.
Right. Or you could have a small, tight-knit group and feel very connected.
Exactly.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So it's not just about, quantity, it's about quality and how those relationships actually make you feel.
Right.
So, thinking about all of this, where do we stand as a society when it comes to connection? Like, are we good? Are we connected? Or are we a little lacking?
Well, the data seems to suggest that we might be a little lacking. That Psychology Today article actually cites the Surgeon General's report.
Yeah.
And it found that between 2003 and 2020, there was a pretty steep decline in social engagement in the U.S.
Oh, wow. So like in the last couple of decades, there's been a big shift.
Yeah, it seems like people are spending less time with friends and family, more time feeling isolated.
Wow. I wonder how much of that is tied to like the way that people are using technology these days.
I think that's a really good question. I'm sure it plays a part.
Yeah.
We're also seeing record low marriage and birth rates, fewer people identifying with religion, even things like civic participation is down. It seems like across the board, there's this decrease in connection.
So it's like a connection crisis.
Yeah, it seems that way.
So if we are in this connection crisis, like what can we do about it? What's the way out?
Well, one of the things that came up in our research is this idea of true belonging, and this comes from the interview with Brene Brown in Forbes.
Yeah, I've heard that term before, but I don't know if I fully understand it. Like, it's not just about fitting in, right? What makes it true belonging?
Right. It's not just about fitting in. It's about something deeper. So Brown defines it as the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness.
Wow. So it's almost like it starts internally, like being comfortable enough with yourself to be able to connect with other people in a genuine way.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. It's about knowing yourself and accepting yourself so you can show up authentically in your relationships.
Yeah, and that probably doesn't come easy, right?
No, it definitely takes work. Brown talks about vulnerability and courage being essential for true belonging. Putting yourself out there even when it feels risky.
And that makes me think about like social media and how much emphasis we put on like presenting this perfect image of ourselves. It almost seems like the opposite of what Brown is talking about.
I see what you mean. Brown talks about that directly. She emphasizes the importance of face-to-face connection.
Right.
She says, while technology can connect us, it can also isolate us if we don't balance it with real-world interaction.
Right.
What about you? Have you noticed that kind of trend toward isolation?
Yeah, it feels like everyone is on their phones all the time, even when they're out with other people. Almost like they're more connected to their online world than they are to the actual people that are around them.
Definitely something to be mindful of. So we've been talking about the individual level, but what about community? How do we create that sense of belonging on a larger scale? And that's where this third source comes in, the Thriving Communities website.
Okay, so what's their take on building a strong, connected community?
So they lay out these 6 pillars that they believe are really essential for creating a thriving community.
Okay.
And they are civic engagement, economic opportunity, social well-being, environmental responsibility, educational access, and then inclusivity and diversity.
Well, that's a lot.
It is a lot, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it. It's about creating a community where people are engaged, they have opportunities, they feel supported and connected, they care about the environment, they have access to education, and they feel welcome no matter who they are.
That's pretty ideal. But can you give me an example of how that works in the real world?
Sure, yeah. They have some great examples on their website. One that stood out to me was this community garden project. They were talking about how it fostered both environmental responsibility and social connection at the same time.
Oh, I love that. A community garden.
Yeah.
Such a tangible way to kind of build community. It's like you get fresh produce, but you're also bringing people together on this common goal.
Exactly.
Really like that.
And they also highlighted this community-funded scholarship program that was really opening up opportunities for young people, which in turn is strengthening the whole community.
So it's like connecting individual well-being to the well-being of the community as a whole.
Yeah.
I really like that it's like a holistic approach.
It is. And it just shows that change doesn't always have to come from big organizations or governments. It can start with individuals taking action in their own communities, no matter how small it seems.
Yeah, and maybe that's the key takeaway here, right? Is this idea that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves, and that our actions actually do have an impact.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's about shifting from a me to a we mindset and realizing that we're all in this together.
We are. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the psychology of connection and then these really big ideas about thriving communities. But what does all this mean for our listener? What would you say is the main takeaway so far?
I think the biggest takeaway is that connection isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. It's crucial for our well-being, and with disconnection on the rise, it's really on each of us to kind of prioritize connection, both in our own lives and in our communities.
Okay, so what does that look like practically? Like we've got this big concept of true belonging, but how do we actually make that happen? What are some things that our listener can do right now to strengthen their own sense of belonging and help build a more connected world?
Well, it doesn't have to be about joining some big group or organization. Sometimes it's as simple as, reaching out to someone you haven't talked to in a while, inviting a neighbor over for coffee, or even just striking up a conversation with someone at the grocery store.
Right, so just being open to connection kind of wherever you find it.
Exactly. And it's also about supporting your community in whatever way feels right to you. Maybe that's volunteering or attending local events or even just supporting local businesses. Every little bit counts.
So it's almost like weaving connection into like the fabric of your life, both consciously and unconsciously.
Yes, and remembering that, building a more connected world isn't about reaching some destination. It's about the journey. There's going to be ups and downs, but the benefits are huge.
Yeah, this has been such a fascinating conversation. But before we go any further, I want to leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What do you have in mind?
Well, Brené Brown calls social connection a spiritual practice, which is a pretty powerful idea when you think about it.
It is.
So how can we approach it with more intention and purpose in our daily lives? What small changes can we make to cultivate deeper connections and create a world where belonging is the norm? What do you think?
That's a beautiful question. And I think it's one that we all need to consider. We've talked about the science behind connection and the decline in community and these building blocks of belonging. But at the end of the day, it comes down to each of us making a conscious choice to prioritize connection.
And that means embracing vulnerability, cultivating empathy, and taking action no matter how small.
Exactly, because a more connected world starts with each of us.
And that's a world worth working towards.
I agree. As we're talking about this idea of connection as a spiritual practice, it really makes you think about how we approach our relationships
Yeah,
with ourselves and with others.
totally. It's like shifting from this transactional view of relationships to something way deeper and more intentional.
Exactly. And it's acknowledging that real connection requires us to show up authentically, to be vulnerable, to listen deeply, and embrace the fact that, human interaction can be messy sometimes.
And let's be honest, that is so much easier said than done.
Oh, for sure.
Like there's so much pressure to be perfect, to have it all together, to present this curated version of ourselves. It can feel really terrifying to let your guard down and show your true self, flaws and all.
Absolutely. Vulnerability is tough. It takes courage to step outside that comfort zone and risk being judged or rejected. But Brene Brown's research shows that it's also the key to forming those deep, meaningful connections.
Because when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we give other people permission to do the same right.
Exactly. And when we feel truly seen and heard, that's when we experience that powerful sense of belonging. It gives us the strength to face life's challenges.
And that sense of belonging can be contagious. When we experience it ourselves, we naturally want to create that for other people.
Absolutely. One act of kindness, one genuine connection, those things can have a ripple effect.
Now, it's a good reminder that creating a more connected world isn't just this abstract idea.
Right.
It's something that we can all contribute to every single day.
And you don't need to make these grand gestures. It's about the small, everyday choices, choosing connection over isolation, empathy over judgment, vulnerability over fear.
It's about seeing the humanity in ourselves and in everyone around us.
That's a great way to put it, and it's important to remember that this whole journey of connection, it isn't always easy. There will be times when you feel lonely, disconnected, even betrayed.
And those are the times when it's easiest to just retreat and give up on connection altogether.
It is, but it's in those moments that we need connection the most. It's about reaching out even when it's hard and remembering that we're not alone in our struggles.
That's where community comes in, right?
Yeah.
Having a network of people that we can lean on who offers support and encouragement when we're feeling lost.
Yes, and community can take so many forms. Family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, even a group of people who share a hobby.
Right. The key is finding those spaces where you feel seen and heard and valued for who you are.
Right.
And then creating those spaces for other people.
Exactly. Belonging is a two-way street. We have to be open to receiving connection and offering it to others.
This has me thinking about all the different ways that we can bring more connection into our life. What are some specific things our listener can do to cultivate deeper connections, both with themselves and with others?
Well, there are so many possibilities. You could try like a gratitude practice where you take time each day to appreciate the people and things you're grateful for, or make an effort to have deeper conversations with people, even if it's just for a few minutes.
Yeah, those are great ideas. But what about people who are more introverted, who maybe find big social situations draining? Are there ways for them to connect without feeling overwhelmed?
Oh, absolutely. It's about finding what feels good for you. Maybe it's spending time in nature, listening to music, reading a book, getting creative.
It's about honoring your own needs and finding ways to connect that feel authentic and sustainable for you.
Exactly. And remembering that connection doesn't have to be loud or showy. It can be quiet, contemplative, even solitary.
This deep dive has really changed how I think about connection. But I'm wondering, is it even possible to create a truly connected world right now? With all the division, the social media overload, the isolation, it can feel like a pipe dream.
That's a tough question. The challenges are real and they're not going away overnight, but I refuse to believe that connection is impossible.
Yeah, because if we give up on connection, what are we left with?
Isolation, fear, despair. That's not a world I want to live in.
Me neither. So how do we move forward? How do we go from this feeling of overwhelm to a place of hope and action?
I think it starts with remembering that building a more connected world isn't a solo mission.
Right.
It's something we do together. It requires collaboration, support, and celebrating our shared humanity.
It's about remembering that we're all in this together, even when it feels like we're miles apart.
Yes, and it's about believing that even the smallest acts of kindness and connection can make a difference.
It's about choosing hope over despair,
Yeah.
love over fear, and connection over isolation.
Well said, and it's about never giving up on the possibility of a world where everyone feels a sense of belonging and purpose.
It's funny, right? Like how much our world has changed in such a short amount of time.
It really is.
Like a few decades ago, the idea of feeling isolated while being constantly connected online would have sounded completely bizarre.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
It is.
It shows how technology has these two sides to it, and connect us with people all over the world in an instant, but it can also create the sense of distance and superficiality if we're not careful.
Yeah, it's like we're always seeing these like perfect curated lives on social media,
Right.
and it makes it so hard to, feel like we're good enough.
Absolutely.
We forget that it's just a highlight reel. It's not the whole story.
Yeah. That makes it hard to be our true selves. If everyone else seems to have it all figured out, why would we want to show our messy, imperfect selves?
Exactly. It creates this whole culture of comparison and competition, which is just like the opposite of what we've been talking about. So, how do we break free from that? How do we build genuine connections in a world that often feels so superficial?
Well, I think it starts with being more aware of how we're actually using technology.
Okay.
Are we using it to connect with people in a meaningful way, or are we just using it to kind of escape?
Right.
Are we having real conversations, or are we just scrolling mindlessly?
It's about being intentional.
Right, and remembering that true connection takes effort, doesn't just happen on its own. We have to be willing to put ourselves out there, be vulnerable, listen to others, really try to understand their perspective.
Which I'll admit is kind of scary.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's so much easier to stay in our comfort zones and avoid those awkward or uncomfortable interactions.
It is, but the benefits of connection are so worth the risk. When we let ourselves be truly seen and heard, we experience the sense of belonging and purpose that can honestly change everything.
And that change doesn't just stop with us, right? It affects the people around us and the world as a whole.
Absolutely. When we create spaces where people feel safe to be themselves, to connect authentically, and to support each other, we're creating a more just and compassionate and thriving world for everyone.
And that's a vision worth working towards.
Absolutely. And it all starts with each of us making a conscious decision to prioritize connection in our own lives.
Yeah.
What small steps can you take today to build deeper connections with yourself, with your loved ones, and with your community?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
I agree.
Because a more connected world is a more beautiful world.
And it's a world that's within our reach if we choose to create it together.
This deep dive has been such a powerful reminder of the importance of human connection and the incredible power of community. It's given me so much to think about and honestly inspired me to be more intentional about building connections in my own life. I hope it's done the same for you, dear listener. Remember, we're all in this together, and even small acts of kindness and connection can make a world of difference. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.